Hello everyone, my name is Brenton Scott. I'm your TA for this course and also going to be a co-lecturer for many of the topics that we'll be covering in this class. Today I'm going to be talking to you about angiosperm life history, and you may recall from the short reading that we posted a little bit about the evolution of plants from algae or a cyanobacteria all the way up to the flowering plants. And what we're mainly going to focus on in this topic and for the course going forward is going to be the angiosperms or the flowering plants, where we derive the majority of our products from. So we start here with a general diagram of the angiosperm life history, and we're going to use the common garden bean, or the genus Phaseolus green bean, for our example for this. As you can see in what Kathleen already went over in the previous lecture of the plant body, we generally group three main parts to the plant body, and that is the roots, our stems, and our leaves. And each of these are grouped into a separate function for the plant. The leaves primarily through photosynthesis and gaining energy, the stems for support and transport of nutrients and water up and down the plant body, and the roots for the uptake of water as well as anchorage and support. But what we're going to be looking at today is actually the reproductive phase of the plant. And this primarily starts with the advent of a flower, or the production of this flower, which is the reproductive organ that contains both the pollen-producing and the egg cell-producing parts of the plants. And we're going to follow this through all the way to the production of a fruit and ultimately to the seed, which is our reproductive dispersal unit, which will lead to the next generation. Now, when we look at the plant embryo, this is actually contained within the seed. At earlier plants, when we look at ferns, mosses, and other types of non-seed plants, these were derived from separating different stages of the plant's life cycle into a spore-producing stage, which too much on, and a gamete-producing stage. We have done in the angiosperm life cycle is we've included this all within a single structure, where the gametes are produced by specific organs inside the plant body. These, again, will lead to the fertilization by the pollen fertilizing the egg cell by depositing sperm, and we'll go through how that process works. And what we ultimately end up with is a seed. And you can see here that the seed contains the embryo, and the embryo consists of, again, that diploid part of the plant, the early root tip, and these structures known as cotyledons, which you may want to consider to be early leaves, although they are truly not leaves. They're actually structures that resemble leaves, have some photosynthetic compounds such as chlorophyll within them, and are capable of early photosynthesis, but are actually not examples of true leaves, as you can see here. Now, depending on the plant that you are looking at, these cotyledons may emerge above the ground, as you can see here, or they may remain below the ground. And in the common bean species here, you can see that the cotyledons emerge above the ground before undergoing photosynthesis to produce the first set of leaves. Now, the vegetative phase, again, consists of germination, in which case we end up with our seedling or very young juvenile type of plant, which will then grow and mature and begin to produce new sets of leaves and even branches at the nodes or sites of growth occurring. And we will end up with stems and branches resulting from this, and eventually, once the plant has reached its full maturity, we can begin the flowering part of the life cycle. And sometimes when we look at perennial plants, we can even see the addition of wood and bark, which is a growth layer to the outside of the stem, in which we increase the girth of the plant, allowing the plant to be stronger and grow taller. Now, there are three main growth forms that we associate with, and you are likely familiar with what these growth forms are. The first of which that I'll concentrate on are herbs, or what we refer to sometimes as annuals or forbs. And these, and these are going to be your plants that primarily have a vegetative phase without any type of woody growth, and then undergo flowering sometimes in one generation, or sometimes can exist perennially. More on that in a minute. Then we have our shrubs, which are slightly taller types of plants that tend to be more bushy, and these can often be mistaken for trees sometimes, depending on how tall they grow. And then we have our classic tree example. These grow the tallest of any plants on Earth, are very woody, and tend to persist perennially. Now, I've used this term perennially, and what this means is that we can group the life cycle of flowering plants into three main types. The first is the annuals, which complete their entire life cycle, again from seed to flower and back to seed in one season, or sometimes in the case of Antarctic plants or even some desert plants in the matter of a few short weeks. Our biennials are plants that spend their first growing season or their first year undergoing vegetative growth to prepare for flowering the next year, which will take place again in the second season. And they typically take on this rosette type of growth where all of the leaves will stay very close to the ground level and not what we refer to as bolt up and produce the flower until the next year. And finally, perennial plants are plants that persist for many years and can even persist for hundreds of years in the forms of many of the trees that we see in our forests. Now, the reproductive phase, as I said, starts with the production of a flower. And depending on the flower you're looking at, these can contain both male and female parts, known as bisexual flowers. They can be separate male and female flowers in some of the early types of flowering plants, or they can be separate male and female flowers on different plants. There's many different strategies that plants employ to undergo reproduction and prevent self-fertilization to increase genetic diversity. But as you can see here, we group our separate structures into the pollen-producing parts and the egg-producing parts. And you may be tempted to think of this at first as your male and your female parts. This is technically incorrect, but if this helps you remember which parts of the plant are produced, then go ahead and actually subscribe to that belief for now. But just know that the actual pollen-producing parts are not specifically male until we get inside. But more on that if you take another plant biology class. What's going to happen is that inside this structure known as the anther, in the male side of the flower, or the pollen-producing side of the flower, we're going to produce our pollen grains. And these pollen grains will then float out or be dispersed by a different type of insect pollinator, and they will actually be able to fertilize the female part of the plant so that we end up with our embryo, which is contained within our seed. Now, what is a flower exactly, you may be wondering? It's essentially just a stem tip with modified leaves, and these leaves are modified to participate in different functions. We first start with the showy parts of the plant that aren't actually involved in the specific reproductive events within the life cycle. These may signal pollinators, or they may be extremely reduced, so that they are just present essentially to enclose the important parts of the flower and protect it during its growth. We refer to these as the petals, which is the innermost whorl, in other words, the innermost layer of the showy parts, which are collectively referred to as the corolla. And these are often the very beautiful types of structures that you see on flowers. As you can see here, the yellow color here is showing you a petal. The sepals are the next whorl to the outside, and these are often green, but sometimes in types of plants, a specific group of plants known as monocots, including the lilies and other types of showy types of flowers. There's really no distinction between these petals and these sepals. And collectively, we refer to these two groups, the petals and the sepals, or the corolla and the calyx in their collective form, as the perianth, or the non-reproductive part of the plant. And the actual stem tip we refer to as the receptacle, the receptive base for holding the reproductive parts of the plant. The pollen-producing parts are grouped into two main structures. These are the filament, which is essentially just a thin stalk that is going to hold up this structure known as an anther. And inside that anther, if we were to take it and slice it in half and look at it in cross-section, what we'll see is four what resemble spheres that contain little regions that are producing the pollen grains that will then be released. The anthers will then split open when they're actually mature and be able to release those pollen grains into the air or through an insect pollinator. And here you can see a classic example of those ridges and that structure of a stamen in this lily flower that you are seeing here. Now, it's important to note that pollen grains contain actually two sperm, one sperm which will fertilize the egg cell and another sperm cell which will fertilize a different part of the embryo sac, or a cell within the again, the egg-producing regions of this plant, or sometimes referred to as the female part, and this will lead to the creation of endosperm. And endosperm is produced in this process that we refer to as double fertilization, where we actually end up with a triploid, or 3N, part of tissue that will feed the young seed as it's growing. Now, the seed and fruit-producing parts, we looked at the egg cell, which is contained within the embryo sac, which is this little green structure right here. And those are contained within an ovary or a specific multiple ovary chamber. These are then contained within this large structure that we will refer to as a carpel or a pistil, which consists of the style, which is this long stalk that is going to connect our ovary to our receptive surface for the pollen grains to land on, known as the stigma. Now, why does pollen actually make us sneeze? Well, it all depends on this complex sculpturing that is unique to different species of plants that is found on the outside of the pollen grains. These both protect the pollen grain and allow it to survive for a long period of time and contain the sperm, but also may contain certain shapes or receptor proteins that will actually get lodged within our nasal cavity and trigger the classic hay fever or sneezing symptoms or allergies, as you can see this little girl having issues with this here. And one of these main culprits that we see that is often an evil plant in many people's eye that is responsible for many allergies is a type of ragweed. And this particular ragweed species here, ambrosia, is commonly found here in the Sonoran Desert and many species throughout the U.S. and is responsible for a lot of the spring allergies that we undergo. Now, back to the embryo sac. If we actually look within, again, this structure where we have our stigma, which is our receptive surface for pollen grains to land and germinate, and our style, which is our long stalk. And then look within the ovary, we can see that here we have our embryo sac. And this is basically an 8-cell structure that is going to contain multiple cells that will undergo different stages of growth and actually contribute to the formation of the embryo and seed. But the one cell that is truly important in here that will become that true embryo is going to be the egg cell. And this is contained deep within the flower, so it is protected from the open environment. Now, when a pollen grain actually lands on the stigma, or that receptive surface here, as you can see in this cross-section of a flower, what's going to happen is that the pollen is going to germinate, or again begin growing, and it's going to grow this long, elongated tube that's going to take it all the way down into the embryo sac, where it will deposit both sperm, one first that will fertilize the egg cell, and a second sperm that will fertilize this other cell known as the central cell, and that will lead to our triploid tissue there, or the formation of endosperm. Now, what's important to know is that the ovule, or the egg cell as we refer to it sometimes, will become the actual seed that you see here. So again, this is the seed that is contained within this embryo sac, even though the embryo sac is no longer evident after it is matured. And this is contained within the ovary. And when we refer to fruits, what we are looking at here is typically the ovary tissue, which can also contain some accessory tissues. When we look at pomes, fruits like apples and strawberries and other types of derived fruits, we're actually including all different parts of the plant, including the ovary, as a part of the fruit that you're actually enjoying. But more on that later when we get to the different types of fruits. And again, this embryo is just one part of the actual seed formation, in which the embryo is going to contain its cotyledons, which are its first leaf-like appendages that contain a lot of nutrients to help the young plant flourish. It's going to have a structure known as the radicle, which is going to grow into the ground and actually fertilize the ground with roots. And then the epicaudal structure, epi meaning up or upward, to grow above the ground and actually lead to our stems. And part of this takes place, or is possible to take place, because of this formation of the endosperm through that process known as double fertilization, where that second sperm cell will fertilize the central cell within the embryo sac and lead to the formation of this endosperm. That's it for this lecture. We're going to be speaking next to you about the origins of agriculture and where humans actually come into play. I'll see you next time.